Fantastic. Good morning. Welcome to this event at the Resolution Foundation, Getting the Green Light. How can we fairly share the costs of decarbonising transport? We've been working at Resolution Foundation through the key sectors which need to decarbonise. We have produced a report on how you make that progress with electricity, which in some ways is the most clear and straightforward issue. And we're now getting on to the really tricky ones. We've got transport and there will be domestic heating later on in the year. And today we've produced an excellent report by Johnny Marshall, Principal Economist here at Resolution Foundation. We'll hear from him in a moment. We'll then hear from Dr. Caroline Mullen, Assistant Professor at the Institute for Transport Studies, University of Leeds, and we've enjoyed working with Leeds, and indeed we've had another speaker from that fantastic Centre of Excellence. We hope then also to be joined by Ruth Cadbury, who chairs the Transport Select Committee. She has been delayed, she's on her way. We expect her in about 10 minutes, but we need to make a start, not least for our online participants. So let's begin, Johnny, with your presentation. Over to you.
Thanks, David. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. As David says, this is the second in a series of pieces of work we're doing around decarbonising different bits of the economy, and this one focuses on how we all get around. So we're going to focus on cars, we're going to focus on public transport, and we're going to focus on flying. But before we kick off, I'd like to say some thanks to the other people who worked on this report. So this is Adam Corlett and Zachary Leather from the Resolution Foundation, and for the European Climate Foundation for funding it. So kicking off, start with the basics, I guess. Emissions from transport are the biggest component of the UK's carbon footprint. They account for about 1/3 of our total emissions. And unlike other parts of the economy, they are not falling. They're higher in 2022 than they were in 1990, as we can see from this chart here. This chart also shows the future trajectory we need to be on to meet our carbon budgets. And this is one that requires a 5-fold increase in the pace of cutting emissions over the next decade compared to the last decade. But it's not just about carbon. Transport is also a big deal when it comes to household budgets. It accounts for about, on average, £1 in every £6 that households spend on everything. And this is the second biggest part of family balance sheets, only to the cost of housing. This means that cutting carbon and all the costs and the savings that come from cutting carbon from transport will have a big impact on household finances. And as such, they need to be shared fairly and equally. And when we're talking about transport, it's the latter of these, the benefits, which are particularly important. When you look at the sort of overall costs and savings from the overall net zero transition, most of the savings are to do with transport. And these are much less likely than savings in other sectors, such as those in housing, to be fairly spread because they're much more dependent on how people get around, which changes quite considerably. Finally, on this chart, we can see that most emissions are from cars, and this reflects that most travel is by car. 84% of all journeys that aren't done by walking are by car. So that means that the primary challenge for cutting these carbon emissions is getting more people into electric vehicles, which means getting more of them sold. And the good news on electric vehicles is they are getting, some of them at least, are getting much, much cheaper. So much so that the government has changed the means of incentivising people to buy them. And that's what this chart shows, sort of pinkish swathe across the middle, or the lower middle, is what the monthly lease costs on about a dozen or so like affordable, cheaper electric cars. And the blue line shows the average spending on cars by families in each income decile across the country. And what we can see is these sort of affordable cars are now very much in the reach of people on middle incomes, and very, very, very affordable for those on higher incomes. And what this does is this undermines the need for continued subsidies. And the reason the costs are coming down, the reason the sort of pink bar on here is so low, is because we and other countries have had policies in place to achieve this for a while. In the UK, we've subsidised electric vehicle purchases with universal grants for about a decade, and this means there's about 1 million of them now on the roads. So what the last government did was move away from this system of sort of equal subsidies for everybody, and move to a policy that more focuses on supply. And this is what the zero emissions vehicle mandate is. And this is a policy that forces puts the onus on manufacturers to sell more electric vehicles, which means they're selling more types of electric vehicles including more of these low-cost models. So this all sounds good. This all sounds like the problem has been mainly solved. Companies and people that buy cars are now picking up the cost of new cars, and the Treasury is having less to do with it. But under the radar, some people are still getting big discounts on electric cars. Instead, as well as a sort of sales mandate, we now have a system where there's an arbitrary and very generous system of tax breaks available to people that buy new cars. And this chart shows one major source of those, and that's the salary sacrifice scheme, where this is a system that allows cars to be paid for through your gross earnings, so before you pay income tax, before you pay national insurance. And what it means is that for some people, particularly those that earn a lot, or especially so for those that earn between £100,000 and £125,000, you can save up to 62% on the price of a new car. This is far more than was ever on offer through universal grants, and it's much more accessible to those on lower incomes. But the big blue bars on this chart also show that a lot of people are locked out from this system because there's a minimum earning threshold, so you can't sacrifice away your income to below the equivalent national minimum wage level. And this means that not only are bigger discounts available for bigger earners, no discounts at all available for lower earners. So overall, this is pretty much a poor use of government subsidy, and it's probably one that should go. But it should go in a way that is mindful to the wider pressures in the electric vehicle market. You know, the number of cars that are being sold at the moment is at best just hitting the sales mandates, possibly falling slightly short. So we could remove these incentives in a way that brings forward demand from future years when there's much less concern over meeting these targets and how many cars will be sold. And we can do this by announcing that these tax incentives will be retired ahead of time. So we could do that, for example, in this budget and say that from 2027, these things will no longer apply, and that will bring forward demand from future years to now and make sure that we sell more of these cars sooner. So despite this one sort of issue in the sort of framework for getting new cars on the road, at least there is a clear plan for getting electric cars sold. There's a clear plan for turning over the vehicle stock from petrol and diesel cars to electric cars, and in time these cars will feed through into the used car market just as non-electric cars do today and become more accessible for people that don't buy new cars, which are predominantly those on lower incomes. But what there's much less of a plan for is for charging these cars and making sure that people can access chargers, and when they do so, prices are fair and low. So again, most of the financial upside from the net zero transition at large comes through cheaper driving, but banking these savings depends on access to being able to charge a car at home, where energy is much cheaper. But 1/3 of all households live in homes without off-street parking, and as this chart shows, this isn't a spread that's sort of homogeneous across society. People on lower incomes, people who rent their homes, and younger households are much less likely to be able to charge their cars at home than those who are richer, own their homes, or are older. And it's these people who are much more likely to be reliant on the public network instead. There's been a lot of debate about what's happening to the public charging network over the years. It's been described as being too slow, it's been described as being unequal across the country, and it's commonly been used as a reason for potentially going slower on electric vehicles, like reducing our targets or other things that would be bad. But on a high level, looking across the public charging network, things have improved recently. The network size has more than doubled in the past 2 years, and it's continuing to grow at pace. But these overall numbers, so 60 or 70,000 public chargers now, isn't what's important for the people in this chart who can't charge their car at home. What is important is the types of public chargers that are being installed and where they are. And this means focusing below the sort of headline statistics on chargers and looking at the cheap curbside chargers that are near to people's houses, rather than those that are, for example, at motorways that cost a lot more to use, or those in places like car parks, which again come with additional costs. And thankfully, again, things are picking up here. These sort of more accessible chargers are making up a greater share of those being installed. It was just 17% in 2017 of all chargers installed were these sort of cheaper to use ones. And the first half of this year, it was more than half of those installed, which is definitely a step in the right direction. But as well as the overall number of them, we need to look at where these chargers are, which is what this next chart does. So what this one does is it shows the number of these sort of cheap, accessible chargers installed over the past 2 and a bit years, which is basically since the pace of installing them ramped up, split across 3 areas based on how much charging need there is in the housing stock. So on the left, you have areas with low on-street charging need, where most people have garages or off-street parking. And on the right are those where there's much more need for public chargers because people can't charge their electric cars at home. And the other thing it does is it breaks these areas down into income deprivation levels as well. So the sort of darker green bars are where places that our households are poorer, and the lighter green bars are where households are richer. And there are two very positive takeaways from this. The first is that the sort of skew to the left, I guess, stage left, means that these chargers are going where they're going to be needed, where people can charge us at home. But crucially and very importantly, these aren't just going in places where people are better off. Many more chargers are going in poorer places than are in richer places. And this is absolutely essential for making sure that when more households or all households are driving electric cars, it's not those on lower incomes that are going to struggle to charge them. So this is very positive. Obviously the charger rollout is still going, but these sort of signs show that provision of chargers is definitely moving in the right direction. Which brings us on to the next issue, which is the cost of using them. So this chart shows how the price of charging electric cars has changed over the past year and a half. So it starts in January of last year, when the sort of energy crisis was in its throes and electricity wholesale prices were really high, and comes to near enough the current day. So over that period, wholesale electricity prices have fallen rapidly, down by about half, which should mean it's cheaper to charge your electric car. And it is, but only if you can charge at home. It's about the cost of charging a car at home is now about a third less than it was at the start of last year, which is good news for those who can tap into that. But the key one here on this chart is the red line and the red bar, and this is those that relates to those, again, cheaper curbside chargers. Despite wholesale electricity prices coming down by about half, the cost of these has gone up by about half. And this means that it now costs about double to charge your electric car using one of these chargers than it does if you can charge at home. Or for someone that drives the average miles per year, this is about an extra 400 quid a year. And this is something that clearly needs sorting, and needs sorting before electric vehicles become much more commonplace. Firstly, because it's inherently unfair. Why should people pay more to drive than others? But second, because it will slow the transition. Everybody that basically can't charge their car at home is going to hold off buying an electric vehicle because they're going to get less financial upsides from it. So there's a few things we could do here. We could look at how we tax the tax regime across different types of chargers. If you charge your car at home, you pay a lower rate of VAT, 5%, than if you charge your car using the public network, that's 20%. We could bring that higher level down to 5%, but that's not going to touch the sides on the difference between the blue and the red lines on the left-hand side here. We could focus on costs that are sort of increasing developer costs of installing chargers. These can be interacting with the planning system, which can slow down building new capacity, add cost to them. Or we can look at the cost connecting to the electricity grid as well. But the latter of these needs to be done in a way that doesn't just push these costs onto others. We can't just make non-driving households pay more on their standing charge for their electricity bills, for example. But the key thing we should probably do is look to competition between different providers, just as we do for petrol and diesel today. And there are worrying signs in here. Some deeper work we've done in the report shows that you can see local monopolies forming in these sort of curbside charging networks. More than 40 places where there are provision of these chargers, there's only one company providing them. And in the poorest parts of some of our cities, this rises to about 60%. More consumer choice on how people charge their car is absolutely essential for fairer pricing, and this should be something which is a priority as the rollout continues. But if that doesn't work, if we can't find a way to compete, to get price competitiveness to bring these prices down, there is a nuclear option, and that of course is some sort of regulation, but perhaps something in line with how electricity prices at home are regulated today. But what I've been talking about car driving so far, of course not everybody drives. How will those who rely on public transport fare as we cut emissions from getting around? So as this chart shows, we can see from the green line and the green square here, driving a car is going to get much cheaper in the future, and the red and the blue lines in the projection show that taking the bus or taking the train is not. And this change in relative prices is bad for a lot of reasons. First is that if driving gets a lot cheaper, more people will choose to drive. This will mean congestion will get worse and it takes everybody longer to get around. Public transport getting more expensive will see less people choose to use it. This will reduce its viability as the cost of the public transport system will need to be recouped over fewer people. So this will push up fares again and start a sort of vicious cycle, which could eventually see many services become unfeasible to run. But the main take home on this chart is that people that drive cars are going to save a lot of money in the future, and non-drivers are going to miss out. So what can we do about this? One option is to basically tax these savings away to move the green area up to the red and the blue area. But this would just increase costs for everybody rather than allowing people to enjoy cheaper savings and offset some of the investments they have to make in the net zero transition. Well, the second one is to make public transport cheaper. Now, public transport is, of course, very heavily subsidised, and this chart might prompt calls for more big subsidies, blanket subsidies across the system. But this would be very expensive, and there probably is a better way of targeting these discounts at people who actually need them. So one way of doing that is thinking about the way we discount public transport at the moment and what we can learn from that. And that's what we do here. So what this chart shows the share of people in each income quintile, so with one being the sort of poorest fifth of people and fifth being the richest fifth of people, eligible for different types of rail card on the left and different types of bus discounts on the right. And what you can see from here, these are basically flat across the income distribution. And this is because these systems aren't designed with this in mind. They're designed for other reasons. We offer discounted travel for young people because they're less likely to have a car, they need to get around. We offer discounted travel for old people because there are social benefits to these people remaining active. But in the future, we may need to reassess this. Some ways of doing this are looking at offering discounts based on benefit recipients, for example. This is a system they employ in France, or potentially even offering cheaper public transport to those who do not have a car. But the upshot of this bit is we need to find a way to make public transport cheaper as driving gets cheaper. And then on to the third sort of sector we're covering in this work, which is always the elephant in the room, and that is flying. So flying currently accounts for about a third of UK transport emissions, and there isn't really a plan to bring these down. And this means that by the late 2030s, emissions from flying will overtake those from service transport. And the opposite of that is, as this chart shows, that the top heaviness of these emissions will increase. So what we can see here is that in 2019, the light blue bars are flying, and richer households have more emissions from flying, but there's still a relatively small part of people's total carbon footprint. But as we move to 2040 and other parts of the economy decarbonise, we'll see that flying becomes a much bigger part of people's impact on the climate. To the extent where the emissions from flying, from the sort of richest fifth of the population, will be more than the emissions from driving, heating homes, powering homes, and flying from the poorest fifth of the population. And of course, there are the range of ways we can bring emissions from flying down. We can look to new fuels, we can look to efficiency improvements, we can change sort of flight routes and flight patterns. We can even fly a bit slower, which has some reduction in emissions baked into it. But there's no standout regulatory option, as is the case for cars. We can't ban flying. People like going on holiday. Instead, there's a complicated mix of potential solutions, each with considerable trade-offs. Would some people prefer to fly a bit slower and pay a bit less, or would some people prefer to, not go on holiday at all? Would some people prefer to pay more and soak up the emissions cost themselves? So it's this mix of solutions, along with the distributional impact of flying here, which means there's a clear rationale for employing the polluter pays principle, and that means asking those who do fly to cover the costs of their emissions. And this will also acknowledge that residual emissions, so we're not going to be fully decarbonising aviation by 2050, it's quite difficult to do. So these residual emissions will need to be removed from the atmosphere, and that will also need paying for. But unfortunately, we're some way away from consistently pricing carbon from flying, as this chart shows. In fact, how we tax flying overall is quite unusual. We don't apply VAT to most flights. We apply air passenger duty in bands, so you pay the same amount of tax whether you fly to Dublin or whether you fly to Athens, despite the latter being about 12 times further away. And we also don't apply fuel duty. But what we can also see from this chart is that the carbon prices we do have absolutely miles away from the estimated cost of removing carbon from the atmosphere at the moment. But if we look towards the bottom, we can see that one big gap is that there's a lack of carbon prices on some flights. And those that go to and from the UK to crown dependencies and overseas territories, those that go from the UK to outside of Europe, and also the non-carbon impacts of these routes as well. And this is something that ministers should focus on, and something the UK could take a lead on. It could go beyond sort of a proposed global framework for pricing emissions, which is widely expected to be unlikely to be strong enough. And the main impact of this will be the sort of second from bottom one here is pricing emissions for flights properly that go outside of the EU. And this is really important because it would signal that long-haul flights will be subject to the same carbon prices as shorter-haul flights. It would allow other nations to sort of follow suit. The EU is already moving in this direction, but going ahead of it would be a way of making that happen quicker. But it will also ensure that people who fly on long journeys don't pay a lower carbon price than people fly on shorter journeys, or even those who travel by electric car, electric train, or electric bus, where carbon prices are applied. Come on, slide. There we go. So to conclude, transport is a big deal. It's a core component of modern life. It's a large share of household budgets, and it's a big part of our carbon footprint. Cutting these emissions will bring upfront costs, but it will also bring very, very big savings. And these will fall to different people in different ways and need to be shared fairly. Electric cars are getting cheaper, and on top level, there's a planned focus on the supply side so that we can ensure more low-cost models become available for people to drive over time. But it's charging in the electric cars that is the key issue, the price of charging, probably more than the provision of charging. The changes in the cost of driving mean that public transport should probably be made cheaper as driving gets cheaper. And finally, carbon taxes on flying should be expanded to cover all flights. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Johnny. Thank you very much, Johnny. Caroline, let's go straight over to you for your comments, please.
Okay, so thanks very much. I should just say I'm an associate professor. So. Okay, that's a fantastic report. It's such an important area, and there's some really promising recommendations. I think you've identified some of the really critical issues for equity and decarbonisation, so thank you. There's two areas I want to focus on. The first in relation to surface transport, so cars, vans and buses, and together. And whenever we're thinking about changes in transport systems, as we are here, we need to be thinking about implications on the total distance that we travel by car and van. So we know from experience that changes in the transport system often lead to changes in total distance travelled. It's something that happens. With electric vehicles, because as we know, we expect them to be cheaper to run, we can also expect from experience that people will travel more, which can be great, but when it leads to an increase in distance travelled overall for everyone, when it leads to an expectation that we travel more by car, that we have things delivered more by van, then it can be a challenge. And it can be a challenge for equity, and it can be a challenge for decarbonisation. So broadly, the risk is that we make it more difficult to manage without a car, so more difficult to do the things that we need to do without a car. In terms of equity, we have good evidence of the problems this can bring, both in terms of people who haven't got a car and for some people that have got a car. And we've seen the sort of affordability at different income levels. Now, for people without a car, we've got good evidence of some of the hardship, the lost opportunity this causes. And it's in the context of the transport system that we've got, where often opportunities are lost because people can't even think about taking them up. They can't get to them. We've evidence of that happening. Where people do travel, it's often long journeys, it's by public transport that's quite fragmented, links that don't link up, and often very unreliable, time-consuming journeys. So when you need to be somewhere, so for instance, if you've got caring responsibilities, you need to get to school, to pick your children up, you need to sort of look after the family, you have to be somewhere at a given time, something else gives. And the evidence is that what gives is training, the sorts of things that you need for career progression and other sorts of opportunities. And it's really stressful as well. So the more we have an expectation that we travel by car, the more risk there is for exclusion for people that can't do that. For people that do have a car, in some cases, they have quite low incomes, and some of the work that one of my colleagues did, Giulio Mattioli, looked at this across Europe, and there is a category of people that are in material deprivation but nevertheless have a car. And we looked at that, or he looked at that, and it correlates with poor availability of public transport. We've also done work on this talking to people about this and talking to people that think, you know, they have to have a car, they prioritise that, and they will prioritise that even at the cost of being able to afford food for the whole of the month. They'll be going to friends' houses for food at the end of the month because they need to have that car, they need that to do what they need to do. So we really need to consider how we can mitigate the risk of the lower running costs, which is great when you're making one journey, it's great in lots of ways, but mitigate the risk that that leads to an increase in total distance travelled. I'll just say a bit about how that might be done in a moment, but just before that, in terms of decarbonisation, we expect the life cycle carbon emissions of vehicles to reduce over time. So that's tailpipe, that's manufacture, that's maintenance, it's infrastructure, but it's not going to go to zero. So the more we have, the more emissions there will be associated with that. Now, there's also, you know, potentially a risk that this will happen with public transport as well, but it's potentially it's a lesser risk, and it's something to look at. In terms of mitigating that, I think the report is I think it's brilliant, focusing on fare subsidy related to income. That's not happened in this country. I've looked at that a few years ago. There's really not much there. That would be really important. But in addition to that, really focusing on networks, on services. Here in London, it's maybe not so bad, but outside London, having those links that might not be heavily used, but are really, really important for people that do use public transport. Services that run earlier in the morning, later in the evening. Again, this is what people need to do, the things that they need to do. And also looking at the walking environment, which is actually part of the public transport network. So it needs to be safe and accessible to get to and from public transport to make those journeys. So it's, you know, it's in a way it's small things, but it's really, really important things. It's obviously it's expensive, but it's an investment. It's an investment in people, in decarbonisation, and we subsidise public transport, but we subsidise roads to a huge extent. So it's, you know, we think about where we put investment with that. And then just finally, and quite quickly on aviation, again, I completely agree that the use of costs to mitigate some of the emissions from aviation, really important, really promising way of doing things. And yes, it's really difficult. I think we can learn from environmental taxes previously, so we might want to think about what happened with VD in cars, because it, you know, in trying to mitigate some of the carbon emissions, there was that unintended consequence of privileging diesel. So we might think about how we can avoid that sort of unintended consequence. But just finally, we have done some deliberative work with members of the public, and there is support for the idea of the fairness of costing flying. Not so much for people that fly just a little bit for personal reasons, but actually for business travel. And this was from business travellers. They said that they should be taxed. So it's really interesting. You would think that talking to people about restricting them, about making the things that they do cost more, would not, you know, it wouldn't really be popular. But actually, once people have the space to think about that, there is support for the fairness of that. But fairness in how that's done is really critical to the acceptability, and that's what we found. So that's all, but yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And interesting your pushback on car use, and we've got some questions coming in online on that, which I might go to first. But no, it's great that we're joined by Ruth Cadbury MP, Chair of the Transport Select Committee. Thank you for joining us. Sorry about your transport difficulties. There was one Transport Secretary who said, the trouble with being Transport Secretary is when other people are late for your meetings, you have to apologise. And so I'm sorry that when we're discussing transport today, you face those difficulties. It's great you have been able to join us and your observations.
Well, thank you very much. And actually, it reminded me of the other factor of why people choose the travel mode they do is reliability. And, you know, I'm very lucky. I live in West London with an amazing choice of public transport and active travel options. And my normally reliable bus, I could see on Citymapper it had left the depot, was only just down the high street, and it sat on the high street for 10 minutes. On I've no idea why. And then I was that juggle about thought, do I go and get to the other bus stop, which is a slightly longer journey, but might have got me here quicker. But so, you know, we have all that information. but reliability of public transport is a factor of why people choose to drive. But let me go back. I mean, Johnny, thank you so much for the report. I found it really, really interesting and very useful. And I also, if I am allowed to come to one think tank and mention another think tank, but it's a really useful complement to the IPPR's report, which they published, I think last week, that's when I went to their session, called Moving Together, People-Focused Pathways to Fairer and Greener Transport. But basically, they used the DFT National Travel Survey and chunked the people of the UK into 12 people types, and according to their carbon spend and their income demographics. So you've obviously got at one end, you've got the highly paid, frequent flyer for business, but also a high traveller of other modes as well, versus the excluded, who probably, if there were better options, would travel a bit more, and various in between. And we can all probably put ourselves in one of those 12 boxes. And I just as a sort of policy, as a help to policy, but also to marketing different choices and options, I thought it was really, really helpful. I'm actually, I think, technically chair-elect. I don't actually have a committee yet. Hopefully by the middle of next week, with the rest of the committee will have been appointed, and we'll start meeting the week after. So I don't really come with a mandate or a wonderful background of research that I've done. So these are my musings. And first of all, I agree with a lot of what Caroline said, and I won't cover that again. So some additional options, thoughts. I mean, it is shocking the way we have the opposite of progressive taxation on vehicle travel, on car ownership and running cars, and that fact in your summary in your report just sort of hit me in the face of the way the better off you are, the more it pays to drive by car. And there's been an element of shifting the balance between EVs and fossil fuel cars, which has been welcome, but I hadn't quite realised actually how that's undone by some of the tax elements. Although I was talking to the insurance industry people earlier this week, and they told me that actually the cost of repairing EVs is very high, and it's very easy to write off an EV by just damaging the base of the car where the battery housing is, and then you can write off the whole car. So there is an insurance premium for EVs, and it's right absolutely to look at the cost of public transport that pays all its externalities and isn't subsidised in this country in the way it is. Now, obviously, those of us in the party of government but not in government are going to continue to make the case of linking transport and transport costs to people to the 5 missions. Get the growth and the health health benefits of active travel, taking back our streets. We know that places with high levels of active travel, streets are more more regenerated, and vacancy rates and shop units are down, and so on. And obviously opportunity to jobs, to study, and so on. So I will be using my role and any work that we do, and based on any work that's already been done by previous transport committees, I will make that point. The other car versus public transport choice that people make is so I said reliability, but also safety. You made the point quite rightly. Do people feel safe on the pavement, getting on a bike, and so on? And it is that's what you know, some of my constituents tell me, oh, you keep banging on about walking and cycling, Ruth, but I'm not going to, you know, drive. I'm going to stick to my car because, notwithstanding in West London, you know, you don't know how long you're going to be, if you drive, how long you're going to be driving around finding somewhere to park, and how much it's going to cost you. But even then, on aviation, one additional thing that I think about, people talk about frequent flyer levies, and as you say, a bit of reluctance to that. But the other thing I always thought about was loyalty schemes. You know, it cost my husband 25 quid for a business class return to Lisbon a couple of weeks ago because he'd built up enough Avios points. And he's not even what I would call a frequent flyer. And, you know, there's further private sector disincentives. And of course, you get paid for your flight by your employer, most frequent flyers, but you personally gain the loyalty points, which you can then use for you and your family to go to a nice holiday on the Maldives while it's still above water. Another thing about shifting and where we put that subsidy, whether it's tax benefits or subsidies, you know, I get a huge discount if I use the Parliament signed up to the Cycle to Work scheme, so I get a huge discount on buying a new bike. But that doesn't benefit anybody on a low or minimum wage, a student, somebody looking for work. But in the UK, in France and I think other countries, Rachel Aldred did some work on this some years ago. They had a fixed pot of money or a fixed term budget on grants, something like €200 grant to buy e-bikes. Interestingly, the people who significantly picked that up were the generally female second car users. So they swapped the second family car for an e-bike. And of course, it's generally women in a family, of a two-adult family, who are doing the short journeys, the ones that often cause a lot of the local congestion. And by switching a lot of their journeys to bike, that's, you know, that helped those neighbourhoods, obviously more likely to be urban and suburban neighbourhoods. So that's useful. So that's some useful data and a different way of thinking. I don't know, I mean, post-COVID, we already had a pretty ropey rural bus service in England. That completely collapsed over COVID. Now, the previous government's £2 bus scheme probably stabilised things. I don't think it helped. And of course, the bus companies, they're living in this uncertainty of what's going to happen to that scheme. But I don't know how much recent data there has been on who has suffered the most and what choices have they made in rural areas. And also how that impacts on the towns in the rural areas, because I do know that places like Lincoln are frequently completely gridlocked in a sort of spider diagram of red on Google Maps, because, you know, everybody is reliant on a car. So many people are reliant on a car to get to Lincoln if they live in the countryside outside, and yet where do they go when they get into this ancient old city in their vehicle? So those are my sort of rather random thoughts, but thank you very much, really useful.
Thank you. Well, there's a lot of questions come in, and of course I'll also give an opportunity to people physically here. There's definitely a strand. I'm going to call up a couple of online questions about cars, and I think it's fair to say, Johnny, that kind of the narrative in your paper is, provided they're electric vehicles and that not too much carbon has been used producing them, you are very relaxed about cars. But there is a bit of pushback, and this picks up with some of Caroline's responses, like this question: shouldn't the government, we still be aiming for overall car reduction, especially because cars are used for these, when they're being used for these short journeys that Ruth was just talking about. And there's another question. Yes, here we are. The question: shouldn't be discouraging car use through road user charging, on which you've done work before. But Johnny, do you want to reflect on that, and then I'll come to our other panellists on whether you really are comfortable with people carrying on using cars as much as ever, provided they're electric.
Okay, so I think the issues around car use aren't sort of the same across the whole country. Some people need cars. When you look at sort of survey data, about 80% of people say they have a car, and about 80% of people say they need a car for their life. But where people are less likely to need cars are those that live in urban places. And as electric cars become more commonplace, it's the cost, the externalities of driving in these urban places that won't be covered by any tax framework. So like road charging mentioned in this question here. And what we've done in some previous work is looking at how those costs can basically be applied to driving in places where driving is a sort of suboptimal way of getting around. And that would be something based on congestion pricing. So based on where the roads are clogged and where there's other ways of getting around, and where they would become more clogged as driving gets cheaper. And this would be something that individual sort of councils and areas could apply based on the sort of impacts in their local areas. But it would be a way of sort of, pricing out a lot of these sort of unnecessary journeys, these shorter journeys that could be done by other means, but still allowing people that do need a car to get around if they need to do so by car.
Right. And your comments on that, Caroline?
So just a couple of things. I think that there is certainly a case for places where cars really don't work, and there are lots of other options. There's a good case for really incentivising that, recognising that for some people there will be the need to travel by car in those places. There is a risk, though, I think, of focusing just on the urban areas and not thinking about, as Ruth was saying, sort of people coming, how people might come in, but also what that focus can mean in terms of distraction from thinking about long distance travel. And there's, we often point to places, countries in Europe that, have they've got some of their urban travel pretty well sorted, but their long distance travel, it's not really different to what it is here. So if we've still got emissions, we've still got externalities from cars, and we've still this question of, if things are set up with the assumption that you've got a car, it's really hard if you haven't. There can still be problems with that. Road user charging might be one strategy. You've got to think about potential adverse side effects, particularly in questions of legitimacy of road use. And I think one of the challenges, the objections to road use charging and road tax previously has been that does it sort of push other users, give the impression that they don't have the right to the road. Yeah. So we need to be careful about how we do it. But the principle of thinking about that is I think, right. Yeah.
Ruth, your observations on cars?
Well, I mean, road user charging or whatever, I mean, there's the elephant in the room is how as we progress towards EVs, how we're going to make up for the lost tax revenue, because it's such a significant element of Treasury income. So the exemptions have helped kickstart, really help kickstart the EV market in this country. And on the one hand, we do need to retain. Logic suggests for the carbon saving, we need to retain the incentive to go EV, but not to the extent that we have such a massive crash on tax income. Other countries have a higher use of toll roads, so it's far more accepting of toll roads, toll bridges and so on than we are. That's a sort of more less sophisticated form of road user charging. It's going to be very tricky, and I think that's why several governments have postponed facing up to it.
Well, you'll be relieved here that Resolution Foundation has already done a paper on that very issue. And I'm going to ask Johnny just a very quick summary of your previous paper, which did tackle this challenge of what happens to the revenues and how the system can be redesigned.
But it's the political transition that's going to be the tricky one, which is why governments of both persuasions have avoided it, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the politics is tricky because if you don't do it too soon, the revenues will fall away quickly and people will become used to not paying tax on driving, and then it'll be harder to implement. But another thing that'll make it harder to implement is, back to some of the work we do in this paper, is the different price people pay to charge their cars. If at the moment, the general expectation is that road pricing should be sort of 5 or 6p per mile to match what it is through fuel duty. But if you add that to the cost of charging your car on a public charger, that'll mean driving is more expensive than it is to drive a petrol car. So people won't bother moving away from petrol cars. So there's lots of politics around it, but making sure there's an offer at the end to people, so that even though you do start to price these journeys properly, there's still an incentive to move away from petrol and diesel cars is another big challenge that needs sorting out.
Thank you. Now, there's one other sort of strand of questions online I'm going to do, and then I'll turn to the physical audience here. But there are several questions about flying. Frequent flyers are all over the news today. Would it be possible to make ultra-frequent flyers pay a charge on their annual tax through their annual tax return? Is one thought. There's also a fair question in the European context, which some of us wrestle with. How possible is it to encourage more international rail travel to replace short-haul flights? So, and I might start with you on this, Caroline. Just your observations on whether what you think is the most viable option, because as we all share the shocking analysis we've seen of the growing amount of carbon emissions from planes, especially flown by more affluent people. Do you have a pet solution?
I don't have a pet solution. I'd just sort of comment that as has been discussed, that there's a strong economic case, and economic theory can be it can be very nice. It makes sense. It's logical. There's a good case there for a carbon tax. That makes sense. My sense from what I've seen in terms of acceptability is that something around frequent flying would be more acceptable. That again and again, when we do deliberative work, this thing about fairness and the fairness of what you're doing is so important to people, and they will think of things like, it's unfair if I'm going out and having one holiday a year, or for people that are travelling for family. They'll be comparing that to business and to the expectations of business travel. So in terms of the public acceptability and perceptions of fairness, I think that might be more feasible. Yeah. And there's in terms of what would work best if we took that away. That's a more interesting question.
Yeah. So you're saying that it is so important, because in the deepest sense, the politics of all this. People have a different view of flying to Australia to see your relatives than they do flying on business to New York. Yeah. And this is where systems end up being more complicated, if those are the kind of moral judgments people expect to be made. Yeah. Your observations on that?
Yes, I'm personally a supporter of some kind of frequent flyer, because I've got a lot of constituents who expect to go to the Indian subcontinent to see their relatives maybe every couple of years, and they would, and as a family, that's a big cost, and they would be resistant. We do know that public opinion puts the climate crisis third or fourth, and often above immigration, as an area of concern. So we know that there's inherently a strong support for measures, but it's how you sell them to those that affect me. The issue about train travel for overseas travel, I mean, I can afford to, and I like travelling by train, getting the TGV, maybe twice a year, and I use it, but it's often, apart from high peak time, it's often 3 times more expensive than flying the same journey, and it's full to capacity already. So until we can address those costs, but also the capacity challenges, that's not going to be the overall option to our expectation of long distance travel. If we could make holidays in the UK more, we can't do much about the weather. Well, I suppose that is improving thanks to climate change. But the business rate system mitigates against towns and villages where the bulk of their business income is 8 weeks a year, and that there's no incentive on a local authority to provide tourist information or decent public toilets. So, I would improve the offer of British tourism and as well to make that comparison, not penalise too much families who, justifiably want to get a week or two sun with their family as a break once a year. I've written something, I can't read my writing. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, I think you have answered the question.
Okay.
Johnny, briefly, your comments on this, and then we'll come to the physical audience. Your comments on the whole issue of how we might charge for jet travel.
Yeah, so there's a pretty wide acknowledgement, isn't there, that flying isn't taxed effectively, and there's a number of ways of doing it. So there's the current system where we have air passenger duty, which, as I sort of said before, isn't largely unrelated to carbon emissions. There's a few bands, but they're pretty broad. A frequent flyer levy would probably be an expansion of that, so having sort of bands but with different ratchets for how often people fly, which would work well to bring down demand for flying, but it isn't really linked to the carbon emissions from those flights. Whether it's someone's 10th or first flight for the year, the price of that carbon in theory should be the same. There's other tax things we could do. For example, we don't charge VAT on most tickets. That we could start doing that, but then again, you're sort of levying a tax on the price of the ticket. So someone who books a flight sooner would pay less than someone who books it later. Someone that needs to take luggage with them because they've got children would pay more than someone without, for example. So again, the sort of link up between the sort of what the issue that we're trying to solve, which is the emissions from flying, is a bit weaker. Which brings us back to sort of carbon pricing and filling in the gaps in the system at the moment.
Air passenger duty was, of course, brought in by Ken Clarke as the incoming Chancellor, facing a large budget deficit and looking for tax increases to plug the gap, and went for air passenger duty, decides to create that new tax. Just saying, Ruth, just saying. So these options are around in tough fiscal circumstances.
I'll have a word with Rachel.
Now, let's see for people physically here. Are there any people here? Yes, let's collect some questions here from the audience. Well, let's collect several in one go. So we'll start here. Move on. Yeah.
Hi.
If you give your name and organisation.
Hi, my name's Claudia. I'm from Brunswick Group, and I work with Arriva. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was super interesting. My question is more about buses and Labour's specifically the Better Bus Deal. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on the bill generally, because there isn't really that much information. There's a lot about rails, but there's nothing too much in the public domain about the bill. And I wanted to get your thoughts on the timeline of it and whether you have any idea as to when that would come into fruition, essentially, and how you think it would actually practically work for bus providers like Arriva.
Right, very fair. But let's collect several. I think along the front there, yeah.
Hi, Mark Williams from Energy UK. I wondered if you could go into a bit more about the difference between on-street and off-street charging, because I think in the chart there you just used the price cap level, whereas in the future we're going to have people on smart EV tariffs, and if you're charging on your driveway, you can be paying effectively nothing to fill up your car, and that's only going to become more prevalent in future. I don't know how we deal with that.
Right, thank you. And then immediately behind you, I think there's another question there. Yeah.
Thank you. Very, very interesting report. I've got two if I could be a bit cheeky. First of all, how much of a priority for you, Ruth, as chair, will the ZEV mandate be and the electric vehicle transition be? How much weight are you going to put on that in your chairmanship? And also, what does the panel think about clean air zones and the point they have to play? There was obviously the point about geographic spread of charges. What sort of interactions would that have with clean air zones?
Great, thank you. Let's pause there and then I'll collect another round of questions. And shall we start with you, Ruth? Not least because a couple of questions really are particularly aimed at you. Your observations.
Okay. I had one question, which was a question for government, and I'm not in government, and I don't know the details. Sorry, this is the Better Bus deal. So the Better Bus deal and the bus bill, I think in principle is really, really good. The point is, it takes the decisions around the whole bus provision in an area to the local decision makers in a transparent way. And I'm old enough to remember bus privatisation and the chaos it caused. And even Margaret Thatcher couldn't privatise the buses in London, which is why we have such a far superior, integrated, consistent, quality, safe bus service in London, which cannot be said for most of the rest of England. So delegating that responsibility and the provision to the local authorities or groups of local authorities, I think is good. How long will it take? As long as they can, in a way, get themselves together. So in Manchester, things are the furthest ahead of the non-London Mets. I think probably so Greater Manchester, West Midlands probably next. Anything the bus companies can do to support the local authorities and the local authority organisations that are up for it, but have yet, as to date, did not have the tools, then the better. And I'm told that Cornwall, interestingly, is quite well progressed as an example of a rural authority. So, and then in terms of the wait for any question about what's your committee going to do, we haven't started work. And as I said in my election manifest, my election pitch, that I would be collaborative. So we have a list a mile long, as you can imagine, of things we could do, and people keep asking me to get the committee to look at this and look at that. So I'm not going to commit, except to say that I've made it quite clear that the work on accessibility in public transport was almost ready to report at the end of the last Parliament, and I was on the committee when that work started 18 months ago, and I'm really keen that gets over to government ASAP. And I don't think the Energy UK question was for me. But absolutely, this inequality, and I hadn't quite grasped. I knew there was an inequality of cost to on-street versus off-street, but I didn't realise quite how bad it was. But the one thing, one thing hasn't been mentioned that is really scary, that I'm afraid 14 years the government didn't touch, is the grid capacity.
Yeah.
And the impossibility of... John Gomer was telling us the other night, he and his family own a pub in the village, in his village, and the nightmare of him just trying to get a charge point for his customers in the pub, because nobody knows how to get that capacity up and running.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a very significant challenge. It is surprising how, when you look at growth areas, what you need to do to help them grow, how you end up, like Cambridge, you end up with a surprisingly 19th century agenda of better rail links, better connections, and access to electricity and material and water supply. So getting the basics right is still a challenge. But thank you and by the way, thank you and we completely understand the position. Your select committee is only just starting, and we hope perhaps our work might influence the issues you decide.
I think that's why everybody's inviting me to their events and sending me their reports and making me read them because I'm speaking about them.
She spotted the tactics. Right, Caroline, over to you, your comments.
Okay, I'll focus on the question on clean air zones and charging points. There's so much tied up in this. I think perhaps the first thing to say about clean air zones is how they're going to work and how they can work fairly is going to be very context dependent. It's going to depend on places. So that will be the availability of or affordability of electric vehicles for people in those locations. but also questions around public transport, and also questions around where the clean air zone is actually placed. So context is important here. One thing, I mean, clean air zones raise this question, the importance of clean air, the damage that's done by transport-related pollution to health, as well as to climate change, is a justice issue. I mean, it's so important. That said, clean air zones, however we implement them, will always have some burdens. The question is how to mitigate them to the extent possible. Now, one strategy, and unsurprisingly, I'd say, is looking at public transport, strengthening public transport, strengthening other ways of travelling. Again, affordability of electric vehicle charging, where electric vehicles are affordable for people. But we might also, in the shorter term, need to think about who gets exemptions from clean air zones. So we know they are placing quite significant burdens on some people that rely on conventional vehicles, can't afford to shift to electric vehicles, and really don't have much of an alternative choice. Now, getting public transport right, I hope it happens really quickly, but it will take some time. So there may be a sort of interim need to look at those exemptions, but as I say, very context dependent. But keeping in mind what you're trying to achieve with it is really critical, and I think we can be, it's a difficult thing to do, to keep everything in mind at once, and it's something that we can be quite bad at, is sort of forgetting the purpose of them.
Yeah, and Johnny, briefly for me, then we'll squeeze another round of questions. Do you want to this on-street, off-street charging issue? There's been some other questions on this online about, I think people have been struck by the difference, how stark the difference is, as you show in your analysis. Have you done any modelling on how we expect this difference to evolve over time, is one question. And what about... yes, why don't you, so perhaps you might focus on that in particular.
Yeah, definitely. So, so Mark's question is very interesting, because we did use the sort of flat charges for this work, and you can get cheaper charging at home and also through the public charging network if you charge at different times. But this is part of a much bigger question about how we evolve our energy system to be more flexible, and how people can benefit from that, and how the people that can't benefit from that don't end up missing out or even taking extra costs. Because if someone is charging their car at night when it's windy and electricity is free or negatively priced, the cost of generating that electricity goes to people that aren't them. So there's a big question about how we can move to a system that allows these changes to happen but doesn't penalise those that don't, accounting for different people's sort of lifestyle habits. Some people can move their demand around a lot more. For example, families generally need to be doing stuff at a certain amount of time, sort of single people households or younger households are a bit more flex. How people engage with becoming more electrified, so whether they move to electric cars or become off the gas grid quicker, is another big thing to get our heads around. And of course, household budgets and how they can cope with these issues. But how these prices change over time, we generally expect electricity at home will become not much more expensive as at the moment, especially as we can make it more flexible. But there's a lot more costs involved in the public system, and those are to do with buying or renting land, installing new capacity. And how this plays out is still sort of very unknown.
Very important point. The divergence could get even greater. Let's collect the last question briefly, and then we'll have a final word from our panel. So question here, and then question over here. Yeah.
Hi, Michael Denness, ex-DFT and now Stonehaven as of about 2 weeks ago. We're doing a report on equity and payment options coming out in a couple of weeks' time. And I'm really struck by the extent to which we're seeing the data come through to support the idea there's a bit of a time bomb sitting under politics here. As a big populist issue, the difference between the way in which we're going to treat rich electric car drivers and ordinary motorists in the near future. And I'm struck by, being a transport professional, the extent to which we haven't really challenged ourselves very much to change the way we think. We're talking about people who are going without food to drive their cars, and our answer to them is, well, maybe they'd like a bus pass. Is there anything we should be really going and picking ourselves up by the lapels and shaking ourselves to change our thinking about in the face of this challenge? Because this is really new and really different, and we haven't been dealing with it for 50 years. What should we be doing now on the basis of your report?
Thank you. Yes, and question here. Oh, this gentleman.
I know you want to be brief. Could I just say one? We
Yeah,
haven't mentioned
take the microphone.
Sorry, I just want to say we've not mentioned cycling at all. What
Right.
could be done to incentivise cycling?
Thanks for adding that to the pot. Right. Yep. Yep. I know we're getting down into bike. I tell you, there's a lot of cyclists here at Res who have views, including about the effects of all those electric bikes dropped off all over the place. Yes.
Yeah, good morning. Martin Howell from Worldline. What do you think of the idea of using data more effectively to understand demand and rationalise and optimise services with lower costs and potentially lower fares, making trains more effective and more attractive?
Thank you very much. Caroline, your observations first.
Oh, lots there. So on cycling, the evidence is make it safer. So good infrastructure, not poor infrastructure, good infrastructure. That is the barrier for people that would like to cycle, don't cycle. In terms of, we have been getting transport wrong for so long. It's really difficult to know what to do. One of the things we need to do is, and you probably know this, there are challenges with how we appraise things. Huge challenges with the things like the value that's given to small time savings. We all know this. We need to change the evidence that we use in making transport decisions, and I think that is possibly as important as changing our perceptions around car use. I think also we need to think about how different systems, so how employment, how housing influence travel demand and sort of force people into car dependence frequently. And again, we see evidence of that. There's far much more than I can say at this, but I think those things are really important. In terms of optimization, yes, but we need to, whenever we're thinking about efficiency, we need to be mindful that we are inclusive in how we do that. So we need to be making sometimes those journeys that are only done by a few people. That can be the difference between managing without a car and not. So yes, but thinking about how we do it. Yeah.
Johnny, your final observations?
Yeah, I agree with Michael's point about this being a big issue, which hopefully we've made some small steps towards helping with in this work. I guess one sort of big thing we haven't talked about is there's a time lag on these sort of costs and savings, as well as the sort of fairness of them. So if you look at sort of net zero at large, people will be asked to change their consumption or make investment today, and savings will come later, and those savings will all be transport. So how to balance, it's not just sort of inequity within transport policy, but it's as it spills over into someone being compelled, for example, to buy a heat pump, which will cost them money, and this will be paid off through cheaper driving in 10 years. So a lot of people can't manage that. So it's about how to try and equalise that out.
Yeah, Johnny's work is, because of course at Resolution we think a lot about distribution issues, and Johnny's work has shown very powerfully that the biggest single benefits from going green and clean tech are above all captured by drivers of cars, especially ones driving long distances, and drivers of cars who are able to charge on the lower costs of being at home. So the gains are concentrated in a group that is not necessarily the people who need the greatest boost to their income. So you then face a whole host of distribution issues, how you spread around more widely the benefits from going green, and that's the theme of the excellent work he's doing, and which you'll see in his next paper on heat pumps. So you've had a taste of it there. Ruth, now the final word to you. It's very good of you to come along as the chair-elect of the Select Committee. So what do you take away from all this?
Okay, well, thank you so much. I mean, the big sort of sharp takeaway I took was the significant cost difference on home charging versus on-street near-home charging. But you've got to build in these, and we've got to make the case and keep pushing on the availability of power, and the lack of data by the energy sector. They can't even tell you. I've got a block of residents and leaseholders of a block of flats who want to get charging capacity down in the basement car park. It's been a nightmare. So that's the sort of little short, sharp thing takeaway. We've had quite a wide-ranging discussion on modal shift. Trains, until we expand the capacity of our rail network in the UK, HS2 was wrongly named, etc., etc. That's our big challenge on rail. Cycling not only make the infrastructure safer, but London has provided free cycle confidence sessions, including women-only ones, because women are the most fearful of getting out on a bike, and they've been too little, but they're helped a lot of people to get on the bike, as well as we've got a rollout of segregated cycles routes and low traffic neighbourhoods. And I did touch on cycling because I brought in the e-bike grant in European countries. Something that I think might be a factor, and not just for people who work. So one reason I don't cycle and don't drive on some of my journeys, even though I have those choices, is I need to spend time on my phone. Now, for me, it's work, but more and more people use phone, for all sorts of ways, and you can't do that. You can be on your phone when you're in a bus or a train or a tube, and that might be a factor of people's choices. But sorry, this isn't bringing in your fairness bit. Absolutely agree with Caroline on appraisals. So I'm going back to you used to work at the DFT. What can we do about the culture in the DFT? Because these difficult issues are often held in the DFT. Plus, what is sometimes called the Westminster Commentariat needs to be aware of what I said earlier, that the majority of people in this country think that the climate crisis is a crisis and think the government should do more to address it. So that comes back to, what people like me, my colleagues in government, and your former colleagues in those key departments, and the Treasury.
Good. Thank you very much, Ruth. I must say, I have observed Boris Johnson cycling along whilst speaking on the phone, but maybe he's not a model that you wish to follow. He was wobbling around.
Speaking's one thing, but reading and replying to emails is a different thing.
Thank you very much indeed to all our participants here and online. Thank you to Caroline Mullen. Thank you to Ruth Cadbury MP and Johnny for your excellent report. Thank you very much indeed.